Canada has a secret deep state with close ties to China. And it explains how the Chinese military nearly found its way into Canada. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Canada, America's friendly neighbors to the north. Panda-hugging neighbors to the north. But like a panda, the soft, cuddly exterior hides razor-sharp claws and teeth. Canada was planning on inviting the Chinese military over for cold weather training drills. But those drills were canceled after the US freaked out. Why would the Canadian government think it was a good idea to invite troops from a hostile communist dictatorship? To find out, I interviewed Cleo Pascal from Chatham House and Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Cleo, thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk about Canada. Usually people never ask.
You know, we care about the Canadians here on China Uncensored. Okay, so the first big question is, in what universe was it decided that the Chinese and Canadian military should be working together?
Okay, so this is, Canada's a funny country. We are not probably what you think we are. We are much bigger than you think we are. We're the second largest landmass on the planet. We're part of NATO. We're a G7 country. We are a real country, a real big, serious country. But we have a lot of different approaches internationally that sometimes come out in this sort of decision making. And one of the things that's been going on for a very long time in Canada is a deep political and economic linkage to China. So this didn't come out of the blue. This was a tip of an iceberg that goes back to the 1880s when Canada was sending missionaries to China. And those missionaries, long story short, had kids in China, white Canadian kids who grew up in China, learned Chinese, became very attached to the culture, came back to Canada. Then some of them went back and got involved in China during the 40s, 30s and 40s. And when they came back to Ottawa after that, this group who are known as the Mish Kids, the missionary kids, got into the Canadian Foreign Service because they had language skills and had traveled. And many were quite idealistic about what was going on in China, and pushed from within the system for a very long time for recognition of China as opposed to Taiwan. This is a very kind of condensed version of that. But there was a kind of within the Canadian Foreign Service, there was this group of people who were very sympathetic to communist China. And when Canada recognized China in 1970, it was one of the first Western countries to recognize China. Among the first ambassadors, among the grouping of ambassadors that Canada sent to China, 4 of them were these former missionary kids.
Why did they? I mean, if the missionaries went during the Qing dynasty, there was the Qing dynasty, then the Republican period, and then the Communist Party. They didn't see any difference between the China that they may have grown up in and what the Chinese Communist Party was doing?
So the Chinese it's a really complicated, tricky question that gets into psychology. So first of all, as missionary kids, they were among the people and were very sympathetic to the Chinese people. And a lot of them, one of them, James Endicott, he didn't become an ambassador, but he became very influential later on, worked initially very closely with Chiang Kai-shek and was feeding information to the OSS and, was part of that grouping. And he didn't like what he saw that group doing in China. He thought they were starving their own troops, and he thought they were, massacring people, and they had, there was a complicated period. And the Chinese, in particular, Zhou Enlai, who he became quite close with, were very good at presenting their case. They knew how to talk to that sort of a person. And so very effectively co-opted him and others into their cause. Now, after they came to power in 49, of course, they got rid of a lot of them. They kicked a lot of them out of the country. But by that time, I think Endicott left maybe in 48 because there was a Chiang Kai-shek hit squad out for him. So he comes back to Canada and he starts up a newspaper, magazine, which is basically CCP propaganda. So from very early on, these Mish kids who had been considered China experts by the intelligence community at the time were embedded in the system, but also became sympathetic to communist China. And they persisted. They persisted in the system for a very long time. So there are other elements to it, but if you have any other questions about that, it's an interesting topic. Happy to ramble on about it.
I'd be happy to talk more about that on the podcast we're going to do with you on China Unscripted. But for now, I think you've provided some interesting context to why some in the Canadian think
that's only part of it. Just wait. It gets better. Okay, that's just kind of one bizarre element of kind of Canadian CCP linkages. But a whole other part of it is at the same time, you have people within the Canadian community who are buying into the whole anti-Americanism, especially with the beginning of the Vietnam War, who also get kind of brought into that whole Canada's a great country and we're going to go save the world, the kind of new missionary type thing. So Pierre Trudeau, who was Prime Minister of Canada for a very long time, he became Prime Minister, I think, in 1968, and he was more or less Prime Minister till 1984, and he was really instrumental in recognizing China. He visited China in 1949, so on his kind of communist tour of the world. He visited in 1960 as a labor lawyer. And then when he came back, and became prime minister, he had this ready coterie of Mish kids in the civil service. And he himself was this other grouping of kind of international lefties who was sympathetic to the cause. And so they came together.
This was Justin Trudeau's father.
Are you ready for the third strain?
Okay.
The third strain is business.
Of course.
So the third strain involves initially this incredible company based out of Quebec called Power Corporation, not evil empire name at all. And they are a massive multi-billion-dollar company that does kind of everything, does a lot of money management, does media, it does resources, all sorts of stuff.
Standard mom and pop company.
Yeah, it is because it's a family company. And the family is the Desmarais family, who are incredibly powerful. The Desmarais family have had 4 people who became prime ministers or were prime ministers of Canada have had some sort of affiliation with Power Corp. And when Power Corp sort of saw the opportunities in China as Trudeau was prime minister, was opening up China, Trudeau came together with the kind of compliant Canadian administration and Power Corp, and they started up the Canada-China Business Council around 1977, 1978, very early. And on the board was CITIC, which is a Chinese government-linked company, very important company. And on the Canadian side, there were a few, but there was Power Corp, there was Bombardier, there was SNC-Lavalin. These are 3 massive Montreal-based companies. So the Desmarais Power Corp facilitated CITIC's first major overseas investment out of China, which was into Canada through Power Corp. So what you're seeing with these military exercises is a very small tip of a massive iceberg that's been moving in this direction for 120 years.
And so that's why, even though it came out, the documents that came out point to decisions made by the Trudeau government, it actually began back in 2013 under the conservative Stephen Harper prime minister. So this is not just one party or the other in Canada. This is systemic.
It partially is, but another thing to understand about when you're thinking about Canada is you have to think about our foreign policy in the context of U.S. foreign policy. So what was going on towards China in the U.S. at the same time? Scarborough Shoal was around that time. I mean, it wasn't as if countries were standing up to China in any conceivable way. So Harper, it was the initial deal was under the Harper government, and it was sort of a mill cooperation arrangement. But Harper since has become very vocal about China. And the current leader, we have the party in power now is the Liberal Party, and our Prime Minister is Justin Trudeau, who's the son of Pierre Trudeau, who went to China 49, 60, 73. And soon after Tiananmen Square, he took his two sons, including Justin, on a nice little visit to China.
Lovely.
So Harper's kind of switched, but the head of the opposition, which is the Conservative Party, Erin O'Toole, who's former Canadian military, is much more direct about standing up to China. So yes, it's embedded in the system. Yes, prime ministers from both parties have been involved. But currently, at this moment, the Conservatives are much more clear about standing up to China.
So the documents about the China-Canadian military cooperation have suspiciously little redacting, meaning things weren't properly blacked out. Why do you think that was?
It gives me hope, actually. If you haven't seen the documents, I suggest you go see them there. You can see them at thechinafile.com. And full credit to Canadian journalist Ezra Levant from Rebel News for getting them and then releasing them so we could all see them. They're about 37 pages, and they're really poorly redacted to the point where it almost looks like the important bits are being highlighted. And I think that there are a lot of very good people in the system who've been trying to get the story out about China being a security problem for Canada for a long time. We had the Sidewinder report was leaked in the late 90s. The Canadian Security Intelligence Service put out a report a couple of years ago saying this is a problem. Richard Fadden, who's former head of CSIS, publicly talks about this all the time. Charles Burton, who's an incredible academic and former diplomat, talks about it. There are a big group of people within Canada who are very, very worried about this. And breaking through is hard. So having international coverage of what's going on in Canada is really helpful. The fact that these China files are being covered by you makes it more of an issue for Canada, which helps the politicians and the diplomats who are trying to maybe say, look, maybe this isn't such a great idea.
Well, speaking of Canadian politicians, I know Canada's Foreign Affairs Ministry begged for the training drills to continue because it would negatively affect bilateral ties. And so I got to ask, the kidnapping of two Canadian citizens by China, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, that doesn't affect bilateral ties?
So thank you very much for mentioning them. The background to that is Canada responded to an extradition treaty request from the U.S. for Ms. Meng, who's the daughter of the Huawei founder and herself is the CEO at Huawei. And we detained her 2 years ago. And within a couple of weeks, China retaliated by taking two Canadians. And they're being held largely incommunicado in detention in China to this day. And you would think that would be a big deal. And some in the Canadian press, like the Globe and Mail, keep account of how many days they've been held. There's a Christmas card lobby going on now where we're being asked to send Christmas cards to the Chinese embassies and consulates to forward to them just so that the Chinese know that people care. And yes, you would think it would affect our engagement with China, but it's so deep and so extensive as a momentum, as an ideology within some of the I'd say small groups of decision making, that it's very hard to break through. Now, in those documents, the deputy minister who's kind of pushing to say we don't break off relations with China. If you're going to cancel anything, you need to get it cleared by us. All that sort of stuff. He's now clerk of the Privy Council, which is Canada's top civil servant. We have these kind of peculiar names for stuff still. So this is somebody who is deep, deep, deep in the civil service. And the idea is they bought into this kind of don't upset China psychology. And if you think about it, how often do you hear China criticizing Canada? They're very keen to, they'll criticize Australia, they'll criticize even New Zealand, sometimes definitely the US. But we're the Five Eyes partner that rarely gets any blowback in China daily. So that gives you an indication that, that we are successfully not a problem, whatever that entails.
Until they kidnap two Canadian citizens when there's a little bit of
but even then, what are we doing? What came out in those documents was not long after, within the year after they'd kidnapped them, we continued the exchanges. The military, to its credit, is the one that canceled the winter training. And they canceled it without approval from Global Affairs Canada, which is our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is what the exchange is about. Global Affairs Canada went nuts. They said, how can you, the military, cancel it without checking with us? This is going to affect our relationship with China. But also in the documents, there's a list of continuing exchanges after the two Michaels were taken, including Minister McKenna, who's our environment minister, going to China to talk about climate change. We as a federal government haven't really, I think, understood China. Like, this isn't how you're going to get back the two Michaels. Anyway, regardless.
Clearly.
Yeah.
So what is the Chinese Communist Party's ultimate goal in Canada?
Well, I think we've talked about comprehensive national power before, and Canada has a lot to offer to China. It's highly strategically located, especially since China is apparently a near Arctic power. It has tons of resources. It's right next to the U.S. We are a Five Eyes partner. We have very good high tech. We had a company called Nortel, which was doing cutting edge research in a whole bunch of areas that was hacked by almost certainly Chinese-based hackers. And coincidentally, Huawei built up a lot of its tech profile not long afterwards with very similar sorts of stuff. We escorted a Chinese scientist out of a level 4 biolab in Winnipeg last summer. Not this summer, but the summer before. Like, we have tons. Whatever China wants, they can probably find a little bit of it in Canada.
Are they going after the poutine?
I think they have some standards.
I beg your pardon. I like poutine.
But I can tell you, currently, everything you'd find anywhere else in the world, you'll find in Canada in terms of China. Currently, they're trying to buy a gold mine in Nunavut, up in the far north, that is not economically viable. But it does happen to have a port on the Northwest Passage, and it's 100 miles away from a NORAD base. It's all the stuff you'd expect. Every single box that they can check from any single country. If Canada has it, that's obviously what they want. And they want us also to keep quiet about Hong Kong. There are 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong, like passport-holding Canadians in Hong Kong. And they don't want Canada to become, a Hong Kong government in exile or anything like that. And we've got massive crime coming in through Vancouver, and we have wheat, and we have gold, and if we open up the mines, rare earths. We're like the Walmart of countries.
Canada's where it's at.
Yeah.
Are the Canadian people aware of this sort of relationship? What's going on? What's at risk?
So, yeah, China's popularity numbers in Canada are very low. They're single digit. There's an enormous amount of anger. And as always, you have to say, to be clear, because it's accurate, this is Chinese Communist Party. This is directed at China as a country, not Chinese Canadians. Chinese Canadians, built the railroad, put up with the head tax, we had a very discriminatory immigration policy, but they are, very important part of Canada. And it's clear. Within the population, it's not about, the guy you went to school with. It's about the Chinese Communist Party. And those numbers are high, but by and large, Canadians don't care that much about foreign policy. It's not a big topic in the media. And if it is, then it's about the U.S. And if it's about the U.S., often it's, especially over the last 4 years, the media, which tends to be kind of center left, like the U.S., has been counter the U.S. So, and China's been very good at playing that card, trying to create divisions between the U.S. and Canada, reaching out to disaffected groups within Canada. China has been in Canada affecting some of the perceptions of China for a very long time, as you saw with the James Endicott story. But by and large, now Canadians are not huge fans of the Chinese Communist Party. This military cooperation thing was not popular at all. But it's not a major political issue at the moment. So it's hard to get it to sway decision making.
So what can be done to counter the influence of the Chinese Communist Party in Canada?
As ever, I think you need more information out there, more coverage, more understanding. Again, if it's not going to, there is some very good media within Canada. I mean, as Canadian media is the one that broke the story. The Epoch Times is available in French in Quebec now. Like, we're getting kind of sort of interesting kinds of coverage, but I think it takes specific events. And we are very sensitive often to our allies, our Five Eyes allies. So in the documents, again, there was a big question from Global Affairs Canada about whether we were canceling the winter training because the US was putting pressure on us, or was it one of the other Five Eyes? You know, was Australia upset about this, or was it just the US? And if it's Australia, oddly enough, that actually can have more influence than the Americans, because we're used to the Americans complaining. So, you know, if the Australians continue to stand their ground, it becomes very helpful for Canada.
Well, great. Thank you for sharing all of that with me. I didn't realize how deep it went.
That's pretty bad. Yeah.
Well, yes. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And as long as the poutine is safe, then I think we're okay.
Definitely. I strangely feel the urge to order some poutine. If you'd like to hear more from Cleo, check out our interview with her on the China Unscripted Podcast, where we go into way more detail. That'll be out later this week. Thanks for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.